Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Ronald Reagan's 1987 challenge at the Brandenburg Gate stands as one of the defining moments of the Cold War. But what chain of events led to this pivotal scene, and what unfolded in its aftermath? For 45 years, the Cold War drove global politics, entangling the United States and the Soviet Union in an ideological and strategic rivalry that left no corner of the world untouched. This was not a war in the traditional sense. It was a battle of influence fought through espionage, diplomacy, and a relentless nuclear arms race. In this documentary, we'll walk through the critical milestones that marked these years of unease. From proxy wars and diplomatic standoffs to the space race and cultural shifts, each chapter of the Cold War reshaped the world's political and social landscape. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more explorations of pivotal moments in history. And in the comments, tell us which Cold War event stands out to you as the most impactful. Post-war fractures. The roots of rivalry. The year was 1945. The world had just emerged from the devastation of World War II, but the celebrations were short-lived. Beneath the surface of victory, cracks began to form between former allies. The United States and the Soviet Union, once united against a common enemy, now found themselves at odds over the future of the world. Europe lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble and its people desperate for stability. Millions of refugees wandered the continent, searching for homes and loved ones. In this power vacuum, two superpowers began to assert their influence. The United States, with its economy largely untouched by the war, stood as a beacon of capitalism and democracy. The Soviet Union, having suffered immense losses but emerged victorious, saw an opportunity to spread its communist ideology. The U.S. envisioned a future of free markets and individual freedoms. American leaders believed that open economies and democratic governments were the key to lasting peace and prosperity. They feared the spread of communism, seeing it as a threat to their way of life. The USSR, on the other hand, was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly states along its borders. Soviet leaders, haunted by the memory of Nazi invasion, sought to build a world order based on communist principles and collective control. As countries across Europe worked to rebuild, the ideological divide between East and West deepened. In Western Europe, nations like France, Britain, and West Germany aligned themselves with the United States. They embraced democratic reforms and accepted American economic aid. Eastern European countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary found themselves under increasing Soviet influence. Communist parties backed by Moscow gradually took control of these nations. The newly formed United Nations aimed to maintain peace and foster cooperation between nations. Its founders hoped it would prevent another global conflict. But even with this organization, tensions between the US and USSR were evident. Early efforts at international collaboration were overshadowed by mutual suspicion and competing interests. By 1947, the distrust between the two superpowers had solidified. The Cold War had begun, though no one called it that yet. It wasn't a war in the traditional sense. There were no epic battles or massive troop movements. Instead, it was a rivalry played out through espionage, propaganda, and proxy conflicts around the globe. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously described it, had descended across Europe. On one side stood the capitalist democracies of the West, led by the United States. On the other, the communist states of the East, dominated by the Soviet Union. The stage was set for decades of tension, arms races, and ideological struggle. This new era was defined by a constant fear of nuclear annihilation. Both superpowers raced to develop and stockpile atomic weapons, creating arsenals capable of destroying the world many times over. The threat of mutually assured destruction kept direct conflict at bay, but it also cast a shadow of anxiety over the entire planet. As we fast forward through the coming decades, we'll see how this initial fracture grew into a global divide. The Cold War would shape international relations, influence cultural movements, and drive technological advancements. From the streets of Berlin to the jungles of Vietnam, from the reaches of outer space to the classrooms of America, no aspect of life was left untouched by this ideological struggle. The roots of rivalry planted in these early post-war years would grow into a conflict that defined the second half of the 20th century. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. Containment begins. As the roots of rivalry deepened, the United States faced a critical decision. How could they stop the spread of communism without igniting another world war? The answer came in the form of two bold initiatives that would reshape the global landscape and set the course for decades of international tension. In 1947, President Harry Truman stood before Congress and introduced a policy that would become known as the Truman Doctrine. This marked a turning point in American foreign policy, committing the United States to support nations threatened by Soviet expansion. Truman argued that the U.S. had a moral obligation to defend free peoples against totalitarian regimes. This policy of containment aimed to halt Soviet influence by pledging economic and military aid to countries resisting communist takeover. The Truman Doctrine was first put into action in Greece and Turkey. These nations were facing internal communist insurgencies and external pressure from the Soviet Union. The U.S. provided hundreds of millions of dollars in aid, along with military advisors and equipment. This intervention successfully prevented these strategic Mediterranean countries from falling under Soviet influence. Soon after, the Marshall Plan emerged as a massive U.S.-funded initiative to rebuild war-torn European economies. Named after Secretary of State George Marshall, this program offered billions of dollars in aid to European countries devastated by World War II. The plan had two main objectives: to revive Europe's economy and to create stable, democratic allies for the United States. Between 1948 and 1951, the U.S. pumped over $13 billion, equivalent to about $150 billion today, into Western European economies. This money was used to rebuild industries, modernize agriculture, and restore infrastructure. The Marshall Plan helped countries like France, West Germany, and Italy recover much faster than they would have on their own. It also tied Western Europe's economies closely to that of the United States. Through this financial aid, the U.S. sought to stabilize these nations and reduce the appeal of communism in regions devastated by war. The thinking was that economic prosperity would make people less likely to embrace radical political ideologies. It was a form of soft power, using economic incentives rather than military force to achieve political goals. The Soviet Union viewed these actions as a threat to their sphere of influence. Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as a form of economic imperialism designed to make European countries dependent on American capitalism. In response, the USSR intensified its control over Eastern Europe, establishing tighter communist regimes in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Stalin forced these nations to reject Marshall Plan aid, deepening the divide between East and West. As 1949 approached, Europe stood clearly divided by ideology and economics. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill had famously described it, now separated the continent. On one side were the capitalist democracies of Western Europe, aligned with the United States. On the other were the communist states of Eastern Europe, firmly under Soviet control. The stage was set for a global struggle that would last for decades. The Cold War was escalating, shaping alliances and tensions that would define international relations for generations. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan marked the beginning of America's long-term commitment to containing communism around the world. This policy would lead to interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and many other countries in the years to come. By 1949, the effects of these initiatives were becoming clear. Western Europe was recovering economically and aligning politically with the United States. The Soviet Union had tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone of satellite states. The world was dividing into two camps, setting the stage for a prolonged ideological and strategic rivalry that would shape the second half of the 20th century. Berlin Blockade and Airlift, first major crisis. Just as the world was settling into its new post-war reality, a crisis erupted that would become the first major test of the Cold War. In 1948, the city of Berlin found itself at the center of a dangerous standoff between East and West. Berlin, like the rest of Germany, had been divided into 4 occupation zones after World War II. The western sectors, controlled by the US, Britain, and France, sat like an island deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany. As tensions grew between the former Allies, the Soviets saw an opportunity to push the West out of Berlin entirely. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces suddenly cut off all land and water routes into West Berlin. Roads were blocked, rail lines severed, and canal traffic halted. The goal was clear: starve out the 2 million residents of West Berlin and force the Western powers to abandon the city. It was a bold move that caught many by surprise. The United States and its allies now faced a critical decision. Should they abandon Berlin, potentially losing a symbolic foothold in Eastern Europe? Or should they risk armed conflict by trying to break the blockade? President Truman and his advisors chose a third option, one that would require immense logistical effort and international cooperation. They decided to supply the entire city by air. The Berlin Airlift, codenamed Operation Vittles, began on June 26. At first, many thought it was impossible. How could you feed and fuel an entire city from the sky? But American and British pilots were determined to prove it could be done. C-47 and C-54 cargo planes began landing at Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin, bringing in food, fuel, and other essential supplies. As the operation ramped up, planes were landing every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day. It was a remarkable feat of coordination and endurance. The airlift faced numerous challenges. Planes had to navigate narrow air corridors, avoiding Soviet fighter planes that occasionally buzzed them. Fog and harsh winter weather made flying treacherous. But the pilots persevered, earning the name Candy Bombers when someone began dropping small parachutes with candy for Berlin's children. Inside the city, West Berliners rallied behind the airlift. They endured severe rationing and cold winters as coal supplies dwindled. But their determination to resist Soviet pressure never wavered. The city became a symbol of freedom and democracy, standing firm against communist expansion. As weeks turned into months, it became clear that the Soviets had miscalculated. Instead of forcing the West out of Berlin, the blockade was bringing the Western allies closer together. The newly formed NATO alliance found its first real test in supporting the airlift. By spring 1949, the Soviets realized their gambit had failed. On May 12th, they lifted the blockade, allowing ground transport to resume. The airlift had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, delivering over 2.3 million tons of supplies and keeping West Berlin alive for 11 months. The Berlin Blockade and airlift marked a turning point in the early Cold War. It demonstrated the West's commitment to containing Soviet expansion, even at great cost. For the people of West Berlin, it cemented their ties to the West and their determination to resist communist control. As the 1940s came to a close, the lines of the Cold War had clearly been drawn. Berlin would remain a flashpoint of East-West tension for years to come, a divided city symbolic of a divided world. The airlift had kept the flame of freedom alive in West Berlin, but the larger struggle between democracy and communism was only beginning. The Iron Curtain descends, Europe divided. While the Berlin airlift had kept West Berlin free, a much larger division was taking shape across Europe. Imagine waking up one day to find your continent sliced in two, not by natural borders, but by an invisible line of ideology. This is exactly what happened between 1947 and 1949 as the Iron Curtain descended across Europe. The term Iron Curtain became famous after Winston Churchill used it in a speech. He was describing the border between Western Europe and the Soviet-controlled Eastern Bloc. This wasn't just a political divide. It was a physical barrier that cut through the heart of Europe. On one side, we see Western Europe aligning with the United States. Countries like France, West Germany, and Italy embraced democracy and capitalism. They received economic aid through the Marshall Plan and joined NATO for military protection. These nations saw themselves as part of the free world, standing against communist expansion. On the other side, Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany found themselves with new communist governments. They weren't freely elected. They were installed with Soviet backing. The Soviets saw these countries as a buffer zone to protect against another invasion from the West. The division of Europe wasn't just about different political systems. It affected every aspect of people's lives. Travel between East and West became extremely difficult. Families were suddenly separated by borders that were nearly impossible to cross. In some places, actual walls and fences went up. The most famous of these was the Berlin Wall, but similar barriers appeared all along the Iron Curtain. In Eastern Europe, the Soviets worked hard to cut off Western influence. They set up strict censorship of books, newspapers, and radio. People caught listening to Western broadcasts could face serious punishment. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda filled the airwaves and newspapers. It painted a picture of a workers' paradise in the East and a corrupt, decadent West. The Iron Curtain didn't just divide Europe physically. It created two completely different worlds. In the West, people enjoyed increasing prosperity and personal freedoms. In the East, economies struggled under central planning and people lived with constant surveillance. The contrast between the two sides grew starker every year. As the 1940s came to an end, Europe had become the front line of the Cold War. Both superpowers, the US and USSR, saw the continent as crucial to their security. They poured resources into their respective halves, trying to prove their system was better. This led to an arms race, with both sides stockpiling weapons and stationing troops along the border. The Iron Curtain marked the beginning of a new era in European history. Gone was the dream of a united, peaceful continent after World War II. Instead, Europe became a symbol of a global ideological struggle. Every country had to choose sides. There was no middle ground in this new world order. For the next 4 decades, the Iron Curtain would define life in Europe. It shaped politics, culture, and personal relationships. Whole generations grew up knowing only this divided world. The idea of a united Europe seemed like an impossible dream. But, as we'll see later, even the strongest barriers can eventually fall. Arms race begins. Nuclear tensions rise. As the world grappled with the aftermath of World War II, A new and terrifying chapter in human history was about to unfold. In 1949, the Cold War took a dramatic turn when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. This moment shattered the United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons and sent shockwaves through the Western world. The balance of power had suddenly shifted, and both superpowers now held the keys to unimaginable destruction. The U.S. response was swift and determined. They ramped up production of nuclear weapons, aiming to maintain a strategic advantage over their Soviet rivals. Scientists and military planners worked around the clock to develop more powerful bombs with greater destructive capabilities. The arms race had begun, and it would define international relations for decades to come. As tensions escalated, both sides poured vast resources into their nuclear programs. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Each superpower knew that falling behind could mean the difference between victory and annihilation in a potential conflict. This intense competition led to rapid advancements in nuclear technology, but it also brought the world closer to the brink of disaster. In 1952, the United States raised the stakes even further by testing the world's first hydrogen bomb. This new weapon, known as the H-bomb, was hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan just a few years earlier. The tests conducted on Alugalab Island in the Pacific Ocean vaporized the entire island before leaving behind a massive crater. The sheer destructive power of this new weapon was almost beyond comprehension. The Soviets wasted no time in developing their own hydrogen bomb. Just a year later, in 1953, they successfully tested their version of the H-bomb. This achievement solidified nuclear parity between the superpowers. Now, both nations possessed weapons capable of wiping out entire cities in an instant. The concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, began to take shape as military strategists grappled with the implications of this new reality. The nuclear arms race dramatically changed the nature of diplomacy and international relations. Every interaction between the US and USSR now carried the weight of potential nuclear conflict. Leaders on both sides had to carefully balance their pursuit of global influence with the need to avoid triggering a catastrophic war. This high-stakes diplomatic dance would continue for decades, keeping the world on edge. As nuclear stockpiles grew, civil defense became a major focus in both countries. In the United States, fallout shelters were built, citizens were taught to duck and cover, and emergency preparedness drills became commonplace. Similar measures were implemented in the Soviet Union as both nations tried to prepare their populations for the unthinkable. The rapid development of nuclear weapons also had profound effects on scientific research and technological innovation. While the arms race was driven by military goals, many of the advancements had civilian applications as well. Nuclear power for electricity generation, improvements in computer technology, and advancements in aerospace engineering all had roots in the intense competition between the superpowers. By 1953, the world had entered a new era defined by the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. the arms race between the United States and Soviet Union would continue for decades, shaping global politics, influencing culture, and leaving a lasting impact on human civilization. As we move forward in our exploration of the Cold War, we'll see how this nuclear standoff affected conflicts around the globe and ultimately led to some of the most tense moments in human history. Korean War, a proxy conflict in Asia. While nuclear tensions simmered, the Cold War was about to ignite into a very real and bloody conflict. What happened when ideological rivalries spilled over into a distant Asian peninsula? And how did it forever change the nature of global warfare? In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, backed by the Soviets and China. The Korean peninsula became a battleground of ideologies, with communism in the north and democracy in the south. This conflict marked the first time the Cold War turned hot, and it would set a dangerous precedent for future proxy wars. The U.S. and UN forces intervened to defend South Korea. They saw this as a crucial moment to contain the spread of communism in Asia. At first, the North Korean army pushed south rapidly, capturing most of the peninsula. But then the tide turned. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur led a bold amphibious landing at Incheon, cutting off North Korean supply lines. UN forces then pushed north, nearly reaching the Chinese border. The fighting was brutal, with heavy casualties on both sides. Cities were reduced to rubble as the front lines shifted back and forth. Civilians caught in the crossfire suffered immensely. The conflict quickly escalated beyond a local dispute, becoming a major international crisis. In late 1950, China entered the war, pushing UN forces back. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border, catching the Americans off guard. The fighting stalemated around the 38th parallel, the original dividing line between North and South. For the next 2 years, the war became a bloody stalemate, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. By 1953, millions were dead, and Korea remained divided. An armistice was signed, ending the fighting, but not officially ending the war. The 38th parallel became a heavily fortified border between North and South Korea, a division that persists to this day. The war showed the dangers of Cold War rivalries in the developing world. It established a pattern where the US and Soviet Union would fight indirectly, supporting opposite sides in regional conflicts. The Korean War had far-reaching consequences. It cemented the Cold War division of Asia, with China firmly in the communist camp. This conflict also led to increased military spending in the US and a more aggressive foreign policy aimed at containing communism globally. In many ways, Korea was a preview of the even bloodier war to come in Vietnam. For the Korean people, the war's legacy was tragic. Families were permanently separated by the new border. The North fell under an oppressive communist regime, while the South eventually developed into a democracy. Even today, tensions remain high on the Korean peninsula, with the threat of renewed conflict always present. The Korean War underscored the Cold War's global reach. What started as a local conflict on a distant peninsula drew in the world's superpowers. It showed how ideological rivalries could turn regional disputes into international crises. As the Cold War progressed, this pattern would repeat itself in conflicts across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The concept of proxy wars, where superpowers clashed indirectly, became a defining feature of the era. McCarthyism and the Red Scare in the U.S. As the world grappled with the threat of nuclear war, a different kind of fear was taking hold in the United States. In the 1950s, Cold War tensions sparked a wave of paranoia known as the Red Scare. Americans began to see communist spies and sympathizers lurking around every corner. This wasn't just a matter of foreign policy anymore. The threat seemed to be coming from within. At the center of this storm was a man named Joseph McCarthy. He was a relatively unknown senator from Wisconsin until he made a shocking claim. McCarthy said he had a list of 205 known communists working in the State Department. This accusation set off a firestorm. Suddenly, everyone was suspect, and McCarthy became the face of a movement to root out communist influence in America. The hunt for so-called Reds spread far beyond the government. Hollywood actors, writers, and directors found themselves in the crosshairs. Scientists and academics were scrutinized for any hint of leftist leanings. Even your next-door neighbor could be under suspicion. It didn't take much to be labeled a communist sympathizer. Maybe you attended the wrong meeting years ago or had a relative with questionable political views. That was enough to destroy careers and reputations. One of the most powerful weapons in this ideological war was the blacklist. If you ended up on one of these lists, you were essentially unemployable. The entertainment industry was hit particularly hard. Talented writers, directors, and actors found themselves unable to work in their chosen field. Some used fake names to keep working, while others saw their careers come to an abrupt end. The government got in on the act too. Federal employees had to sign loyalty oaths, swearing they weren't communists. The House Un-American Activities Committee held televised hearings that were part political theater and part witch hunt. People were called to testify about their political beliefs and name names of others they suspected of communist ties. It was a no-win situation. Either you betrayed your friends or you were labeled un-American. This climate of fear had a chilling effect on free speech and civil liberties. People were afraid to express opinions that might be seen as too left-wing. Libraries removed books that were deemed subversive. Even children's cartoons weren't safe from scrutiny. The message was clear: conform or be cast out. McCarthy's influence reached its peak in the early 1950s. He held his own Senate hearings accusing the Army of harboring communists, but this time he went too far. The Army McCarthy hearings were televised, and Americans got to see McCarthy's bullying tactics up close. His popularity began to wane, and other senators finally stood up to him. By the mid-1950s, McCarthy was discredited, but the damage was done. The Red Scare had left deep scars on American society and politics. Thousands of innocent people had lost their jobs or been socially ostracized. The country's tradition of free speech and open debate had been seriously undermined. It would take years for some of these wounds to heal. The legacy of this period is complex. On one hand, it showed how easily fear and suspicion can be weaponized in times of national anxiety. On the other, it eventually led to a backlash against government overreach and a renewed appreciation for civil liberties. The Red Scare serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting ideological fervor override basic rights and freedoms. The formation of military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. As the Red Scare gripped America, a much larger chess game was unfolding across the Atlantic. In 1949, the United States and its allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This wasn't just another political agreement. NATO was a military alliance designed to protect Western Europe from Soviet aggression. The idea was simple but powerful. An attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. This commitment to collective defense sent a clear message to the Soviet Union that the West was united and ready to fight if necessary. NATO quickly became a symbol of Western solidarity. Countries like France, Britain, and West Germany joined forces with the U.S., creating a military bloc that stretched across the North Atlantic. They began joint military exercises, shared intelligence, and developed common strategies to counter Soviet expansion. For the first time since World War II, Western Europe felt like it had a real defense against the growing communist threat. The Soviets didn't sit idle while NATO took shape. In 1955, they responded by forming their own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. This group included the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. The Warsaw Pact mirrored NATO in many ways, but with a key difference. While NATO was a voluntary alliance of independent nations, the Warsaw Pact was dominated by the Soviet Union. Moscow used the pact to maintain control over its Eastern European allies and keep them in line with Soviet interests. With these two alliances in place, Europe was now divided into two armed camps. NATO countries stood on one side, backed by American military might. Warsaw Pact nations lined up on the other, with Soviet tanks and troops ready to roll. The continent became a powder keg, with both sides building up massive arsenals and preparing for a conflict they hoped would never come. The military buildup was staggering. NATO and Warsaw Pact countries poured resources into their armed forces. They stockpiled weapons, trained troops, and developed new technologies. Military bases sprang up across Europe, and the skies were filled with patrol planes watching for any sign of enemy movement. The scale of this arms race was unlike anything the world had seen before. These alliances weren't just about military power. They reflected the deep ideological divide of the Cold War. NATO represented the capitalist, democratic West, while the Warsaw Pact embodied the communist East. Each side saw the other as a fundamental threat to their way of life. This wasn't just a clash of armies, but a battle of ideas and systems of government. The formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact raised the stakes of the Cold War to new heights. Now, even a small conflict in Europe had the potential to draw in both superpowers and their allies. A border skirmish could quickly escalate into a global war. This made every interaction between East and West incredibly tense. Diplomats and military leaders had to carefully navigate this new reality, always aware that one wrong move could trigger a catastrophe. As the 1950s progressed, the world settled into an uneasy balance of power. NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced each other across the Iron Curtain, neither side willing to back down. This military standoff would define international relations for decades to come, shaping everything from politics and economics to culture and technology. The Cold War had entered a new phase, and the threat of large-scale conflict loomed larger than ever before. The Hungarian Uprising, Soviet control challenged. While superpowers squared off across the Iron Curtain, a spark of defiance ignited behind enemy lines. What happened when ordinary citizens dared to challenge the mighty Soviet war machine? The Hungarian Uprising of 1956 would test the limits of Soviet control and reveal the true cost of freedom in the Cold War era. In 1956, Hungary erupted in a wave of protests against Soviet influence. This was one of the first major challenges to Soviet control in Eastern Europe. The people of Hungary wanted change. They were tired of living under the thumb of Moscow. They dreamed of political freedom and an end to Soviet interference in their country. Students, workers, and intellectuals joined together calling for big changes. They wanted Soviet troops out of Hungary, and they wanted their country to be neutral and independent. At first, it looked like the protesters might actually succeed. The Soviet Union seemed willing to talk, maybe even make some concessions. But then, everything changed. The Soviets decided this uprising was too dangerous. If Hungary broke free, what would stop other countries from doing the same? They couldn't let that happen. So they made a brutal decision to crush the rebellion and show everyone who was really in charge. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, the capital city of Hungary. The streets that had been filled with hopeful protesters were now battlegrounds. The Hungarian people fought back bravely, but they were no match for the Soviet military machine. The uprising was put down with overwhelming force. Thousands of Hungarians were killed in the fighting. Many more were thrown in prison or forced to flee their homeland. The brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising sent a clear message to the rest of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union would not tolerate any challenges to its power. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany watched and learned. The dream of breaking free from Soviet control suddenly seemed much more distant and dangerous. For the people of Hungary, the aftermath was devastating. the brief taste of freedom was replaced by even tighter Soviet control. The government cracked down on any signs of dissent. Many of the country's best and brightest had been killed or forced into exile. It would take decades for Hungary to recover from this trauma. The Hungarian uprising had big consequences for the Cold War, too. In the West, people were shocked by the Soviet Union's brutal response. Many who had sympathized with communism now saw its true face. The United States and its allies condemned the Soviet action, but they didn't intervene directly. They were afraid of starting a wider conflict that could lead to nuclear war. This event showed the limits of the West's containment policy. While they talked about rolling back communism, they weren't willing to risk open war with the Soviet Union. For people living behind the Iron Curtain, this was a bitter lesson. They might hope for Western help, but when push came to shove, they were on their own. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 was a turning point in the Cold War. It showed the world the true nature of Soviet power and the limits of resistance in Eastern Europe. The bravery of the Hungarian people inspired many, but their defeat cast a long shadow. The dream of freedom remained alive, but the cost of challenging Soviet control was now painfully clear. Sputnik and the space race ignites. As the dust settled from Hungary's failed uprising, a new battlefield emerged, not on Earth, but high above it. What if the next Cold War showdown wasn't about tanks and troops, but satellites and spacemen? In 1957, a small metal sphere changed everything, turning the eyes of both superpowers skyward. The Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. This beeping ball, no bigger than a beach ball, sent waves of fear and amazement across the globe. For the first time, humans had reached beyond our planet, and it wasn't the Americans who got there first. The US was caught off guard, and suddenly the space above us became the new frontier of the Cold War. Sputnik's success showed that the Soviets were ahead in rocket technology. This wasn't just about scientific bragging rights. If they could launch a satellite, they could also launch nuclear missiles. The US realized they were falling behind in a crucial area of the Cold War competition. They had to catch up, and fast. The American response was massive. President Eisenhower created NASA, a whole new government agency dedicated to space exploration. Schools focused more on science and math, hoping to create a new generation of rocket scientists. The US poured money and resources into its space program, determined to close the gap with the Soviets. But the Soviets weren't done yet. In 1961, they scored another huge victory. Yuri Gagarin became the first human to go to space, orbiting the Earth and returning safely. Once again, the US was left playing catch-up. The American people were getting worried. Were they losing the Cold War? Was communism proving to be the better system? President Kennedy knew he had to do something big to restore American confidence. He announced an incredible goal. The U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. This was a huge gamble. No one knew if it was even possible, but Kennedy was betting America's prestige on making it happen. The space race was now in full swing. Both sides pushed the boundaries of technology, trying to outdo each other with each new mission. The Soviets sent the first woman into space. The U.S. launched the first spacewalk. Each achievement was broadcast around the world, a very public battle for technological supremacy. All of this led up to 1969. After years of work and billions of dollars spent, the U.S. was ready to try for the moon. The whole world watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the lunar surface. As Armstrong took his famous first step, it wasn't just a victory for America. It was a triumph for all of humanity. The space race showed how the Cold War pushed both sides to incredible achievements. Without this competition, we might not have satellites, GPS, or many of the technologies we rely on today. But it also highlighted the immense resources both superpowers were willing to spend to prove their system was better. While people were reaching for the stars, problems on Earth like poverty and inequality often took a back seat. In the end, the space race gave us a new perspective on our planet. Astronauts saw the Earth as a small, fragile ball in the vastness of space. This view inspired many to think differently about our world and our place in it. The Cold War may have driven us to space, but what we found there belonged to all of humanity. Berlin Crisis and Wall Construction, Dividing a City. While humanity's gaze was fixed on the stars, a different kind of division was taking shape on Earth. Imagine waking up one morning to find your city sliced in two, your neighbors and family suddenly unreachable. In 1961, this became a shocking reality for the people of Berlin. By 1961, thousands of East Germans were fleeing to the west through Berlin. This mass exodus was causing big problems for the Soviet-controlled East Germany. They were losing their best and brightest citizens, and it was making their system look bad. The Soviet Union and East Germany decided they had to do something drastic to stop this flow of people. On August 13, 1961, the world woke up to a city divided. Overnight, East German soldiers had put up barbed wire fences and barriers all across Berlin. Families and neighborhoods were suddenly cut in two. People who had gone to visit relatives in one part of the city found themselves unable to return home. The Berlin Wall was born, and it would stand for 28 years as a concrete embodiment of the Cold War. At first, the wall was just barbed wire and makeshift barriers, but soon it became something much more permanent and intimidating. A massive concrete wall went up, complete with guard towers, armed patrols, and a deadly area known as the Death Strip. This no-man's land between the inner and outer walls was filled with obstacles, tripwires, and guards with orders to shoot anyone trying to escape. The wall became a stark symbol of the Iron Curtain that divided Europe. On one side was the capitalist West, with its promise of freedom and prosperity. On the other was the communist East, where the state controlled every aspect of life. The contrast between the two sides of Berlin couldn't have been clearer. West Berlin was rebuilt and thriving, while East Berlin seemed stuck in time, still showing the scars of World War II. For the people of Berlin, the wall was a daily reminder of the Cold War's human cost. Families were torn apart. Friends couldn't see each other. Workers were cut off from their jobs. The wall didn't just divide a city, it divided lives. Some East Germans tried to escape despite the dangers. They dug tunnels, hid in car trunks, and even tried to fly over the wall in homemade hot air balloons. Many died in these attempts, shot by border guards or killed by the wall's deadly defenses. The US and its allies protested the wall's construction, but they didn't take military action. They were afraid of starting a war with the Soviet Union. Instead, they used the wall as a propaganda tool, pointing to it as proof of communism's failures. President Kennedy visited Berlin in 1963 and gave his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, showing solidarity with the city's divided people. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall stood as a physical reminder of the Cold War's divisions. It became a canvas for graffiti artists on the western side, while the eastern side remained a stark, forbidding barrier. Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous crossing point between East and West, became a symbol of the tense standoff between the superpowers. The wall's legacy went far beyond Berlin. It showed the lengths the Soviet Union would go to maintain control over its empire. It also highlighted the fundamental differences between the communist and capitalist systems. The wall stood as a challenge to the idea of freedom of movement, a basic human right that many in the West took for granted. Cuban Missile Crisis, the world on the brink. The Berlin Wall showed how far the Cold War had divided the world, but an even more dangerous crisis was about to unfold. In October 1962, U.S. spy planes spotted something alarming on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The Soviets were setting up nuclear missiles that could hit major American cities in minutes. This discovery sent shockwaves through the U.S. government. The Cold War was suddenly very hot and very close to home. President John F. Kennedy faced a terrible choice. He could attack Cuba and risk starting a nuclear war, or he could do nothing and let the Soviets gain a huge advantage. Kennedy decided on a middle path. He ordered a naval blockade of Cuba, calling it a quarantine to avoid it sounding too much like an act of war. U.S. ships would stop any Soviet vessels trying to reach the island. Kennedy went on TV to tell the American people about the crisis. He demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles from Cuba. For the next 13 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying more missiles were heading towards the blockade. Would they try to break through? If the U.S. Navy fired on them, it could trigger a war. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev exchanged letters trying to find a peaceful solution. But hardliners on both sides pushed for military action. U.S. generals wanted to invade Cuba. Soviet officers in Cuba had authority to use tactical nuclear weapons if attacked. The situation got even more tense when a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the American pilot. Another U-2 accidentally flew into Soviet airspace. It seemed like any small mistake could set off a chain reaction leading to nuclear war. Kennedy's advisors were divided on what to do. Some wanted airstrikes on the missile sites. Others favored diplomacy. Kennedy had to make the final call knowing millions of lives hung in the balance. Finally, on October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the U.S. promised not to invade the island. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. Both sides stepped back from the brink of nuclear war, and the world breathed a huge sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed how dangerous the Cold War had become. A local dispute could quickly escalate to the threat of global destruction. It led to some positive changes. The U.S. and Soviet Union set up a hotline for direct communication between leaders. They also began arms control talks to limit nuclear weapons. But the underlying tensions of the Cold War remained. The world had come frighteningly close to nuclear war. It was a lesson leaders on both sides would not soon forget. The Vietnam War escalates, America's deepening involvement. The Vietnam War started small, but it didn't stay that way. In 1965, the United States decided to get a lot more involved. What had been mostly a local fight suddenly became a big Cold War battleground. The U.S. was worried about communism spreading in Southeast Asia. They didn't want another country to fall to the communists, so they sent in the troops, hundreds of thousands of them. American soldiers poured into Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese government fight against the Communist North. But this wasn't a simple war. The U.S. military was used to fighting big battles with tanks and planes. In Vietnam, they faced a very different kind of enemy. The North Vietnamese army was tough and well-trained. Even worse were the Viet Cong. These were guerrilla fighters who blended in with the local people. One minute, they might be working in a rice field. The next, they'd be attacking American troops. The U.S. had better weapons and technology, but that didn't always help in the dense jungles of Vietnam. The fighting was brutal and the casualties were high. American soldiers struggled with the unfamiliar terrain and climate. The heat was intense and diseases were common. Booby traps and landmines were everywhere. It was hard to know who was a friend and who was an enemy. Despite all their firepower, the U.S. forces couldn't seem to win. The war dragged on year after year. Back home in America, things were getting tense. At first, many people supported the war. They believed it was important to stop communism. But as the fighting went on and more soldiers died, opinions started to change. College students began protesting against the war. They held big demonstrations and burned their draft cards. The nightly news showed graphic images of the fighting. people started to wonder if the war was worth it. The protests got bigger and louder. In 1970, things came to a head when National Guard troops fired on student protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 of them. The country seemed to be tearing itself apart over the war. Some people thought the protesters were traitors. Others believed the government was lying about the war. It was a confusing and angry time. By the early 1970s, the U.S. government knew they had to change course. They started pulling troops out of Vietnam. They called this Vietnamization. The idea was to let the South Vietnamese army do more of the fighting. But it wasn't enough. In 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The last Americans had to be evacuated by helicopter from the roof of the U.S. Embassy. The war was over, and the communists had won. The Vietnam War left deep scars in America. It showed that even with all its power, the U.S. couldn't always get what it wanted. The Cold War suddenly didn't seem so simple anymore. The idea of stopping communism wherever it appeared no longer made sense to many people. Vietnam became a painful lesson about the limits of American power and the dangers of getting involved in faraway conflicts. Prague Spring and Brezhnev Doctrine. Suppression in Czechoslovakia. While America grappled with the fallout from Vietnam, another drama was unfolding behind the Iron Curtain. In 1968, a small country dared to dream of freedom, setting off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the Soviet Empire. What happened when Czechoslovakia tried to put a human face on socialism? It all started when Alexander Dubček became the leader of Czechoslovakia's Communist Party. He had some big ideas about how to make life better for his people. Dubček wanted to create what he called socialism with a human face. This wasn't about getting rid of communism completely. Instead, he wanted to soften some of the harsh rules and give people more freedom. Dubček's reforms were pretty radical for a Soviet bloc country. He loosened up on censorship so people could speak their minds more freely. The press got more freedom to report on things that were actually happening. Czechs and Slovaks could even travel to the West, something that was unheard of in most communist countries. People were excited. For the first time in years, they felt like they had a say in how their country was run. This period became known as the Prague Spring. It wasn't about the season, but about new ideas blooming after years of strict control. Artists started creating works that criticized the government. Writers published books that had been banned. People gathered in cafes to talk about politics without fear of being arrested. There was a feeling of hope in the air, like maybe communism could work if it just loosened up a bit. But leaders in Moscow didn't see it that way. To them, Dubček's reforms were dangerous. They worried that if Czechoslovakia got too free, other countries in Eastern Europe might want the same thing. The Soviets had worked hard to keep control of their empire, and they weren't about to let it slip away because of some reforms. On August 20, 1968, the Soviet Union made its move. Tanks from the Warsaw Pact countries rolled into Czechoslovakia. Soldiers filled the streets of Prague. The invasion was massive, around 500,000 troops in total. Czechoslovakia's army was ordered not to fight back, so the country was taken over in a matter of hours. Czechs and Slovaks were shocked and angry. They protested in the streets, arguing with the Soviet soldiers. Some people even tried to block the tanks with their bodies. But it was no use. The Soviet military was just too powerful. Dubček and other reform leaders were arrested and taken to Moscow. After the invasion, the Soviets installed a new government that was loyal to Moscow. All of Dubček's reforms were rolled back. The brief taste of freedom was over. To justify their actions, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev came up with what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. This said that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any socialist country if communist rule was threatened. It was a clear message to the rest of Eastern Europe. Don't even think about following Czechoslovakia's example. The crushing of the Prague Spring had a big impact on the Cold War. For people in the West, it showed the true face of Soviet communism. Any illusions about the USSR being a workers' paradise were shattered. In Eastern Europe, people realized that any hope for real change within the Soviet system was probably hopeless. The dream of freedom was still alive, but now it seemed further away than ever. Détente, a diplomatic thaw and SALT talks. The tanks had barely left Prague when both superpowers began to reconsider their strategies. What if the next crisis pushed them over the edge into nuclear war? This chilling thought led to one of the most surprising chapters in Cold War history, a time when enemies became cautious partners in their own survival. By the late 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union realized they needed to cool things down. They'd been building more and more nuclear weapons for years and fighting proxy wars all over the globe. Now, they wanted to find a way to talk to each other without giving up their core beliefs. This new approach was called détente, which is just a fancy French word for relaxing tensions. The big focus of détente was trying to get a handle on all those nuclear weapons. Both sides knew they had way more than they needed to blow up the world several times over. So they started something called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. The idea was to put some limits on how many nuclear missiles each side could have. In 1972, the US and USSR signed the first SALT agreement. They agreed to cap the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and put some rules around anti-ballistic missile systems. This was a big deal because for the first time, the superpowers were actually agreeing to limit their nuclear arsenals instead of just building more and more. The talks didn't stop there. In 1979, they signed SALT II, which tried to put even more limits on nuclear weapons. But this one never really got off the ground because Cold War tensions started heating up again soon after. Still, it showed that the two sides were at least trying to find ways to avoid blowing each other up. Détente wasn't just about weapons, though. The US and USSR also started doing more business with each other and even had some cultural exchanges. American students might go to study in Moscow, while Soviet athletes compete in the US. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was a lot better than the constant fear of nuclear war. We shouldn't think détente solved all the problems of the Cold War. The US and USSR were still very much enemies with totally different ideas about how the world should work. But it did show that even bitter rivals could find some common ground when it came to avoiding total destruction. This period of relaxed tensions lasted for about a decade. It was a time when people could breathe a little easier, knowing that World War III wasn't likely to break out at any moment. Of course, things would heat up again later, but for a while, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, the Cold War could end with handshakes instead of mushroom clouds. Oil crisis and economic stresses in the West. In 1973, Arab oil producers imposed an embargo on countries supporting Israel. Oil prices quadrupled, causing economic chaos in the West. Long lines formed at gas stations as fuel was rationed. Inflation and unemployment rose dramatically. The crisis exposed the vulnerability of Western economies. It also highlighted the growing power of developing nations. The Soviet Union benefited from higher oil prices. The economic turmoil of the 1970s strained the Western alliance. The oil crisis began when members of OPEC decided to punish Western nations for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. They cut oil production and stopped exports to countries like the United States and the Netherlands. This sudden shortage of oil sent shockwaves through the global economy. Western countries had become heavily dependent on cheap Middle Eastern oil to fuel their industries and heat their homes. Now, that steady supply was disrupted. The effects were felt quickly and severely. In the US, gas prices nearly doubled overnight. People had to wait in long lines at gas stations, often for hours, just to fill up their tanks. Some gas stations ran out of fuel completely. The government introduced rationing, where people could only buy gas on certain days based on their license plate numbers. They also lowered highway speed limits to conserve fuel. Heating oil became scarce and expensive as winter approached. But the crisis went far beyond just inconvenience at the pump. It sparked widespread economic turmoil across the industrialized world. As energy costs soared, it drove up the prices of almost everything. Inflation took off, reaching double digits in many countries. At the same time, economic growth slowed, leading to a period of stagflation, high inflation combined with high unemployment and slow growth. This was a nightmare scenario for economists and policymakers who struggled to respond. The oil crisis exposed how vulnerable Western economies had become to outside forces. For decades, they had built their prosperity on cheap and plentiful oil. Now, that foundation was shaken. It became clear that small groups of oil-producing nations had enormous power over the global economy. This shift in balance of power was a wake-up call for Western leaders. In response, Western governments started looking for ways to reduce their dependence on foreign oil. They invested in alternative energy sources like nuclear power and promoted energy conservation. People were encouraged to insulate their homes, use less electricity, and drive more fuel-efficient cars. The crisis also spurred the development of new oil fields in places like Alaska and the North Sea. While the West struggled, the Soviet Union actually benefited from the crisis. As a major oil producer, it enjoyed higher revenues from selling its oil. This gave the Soviet economy a boost and allowed it to expand its influence in the developing world. The crisis showed how economic shocks could shift the balance of power in unexpected ways. As the dust settled, it was clear that the world had entered a new era of global economic interdependence. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, renewed hostilities. The Cold War took a dramatic turn in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This wasn't just another skirmish, it was a full-scale military operation that would have far-reaching consequences. The Soviets said they were there to help the Afghan government fight against the rebels, but the West saw it differently. To countries like the United States, this looked like the Soviet Union trying to expand its influence into the Middle East. It set off alarm bells in Washington and other Western capitals. The Afghan people didn't take kindly to the Soviet invasion. Many of them joined resistance groups known as the Mujahideen. These fighters were tough and determined. They knew the rugged Afghan terrain much better than the Soviet soldiers. What was supposed to be a quick operation for the Soviets turned into a long and bloody guerrilla war. The Mujahideen used hit-and-run tactics, hiding in the mountains and striking when the Soviets least expected it. The United States saw an opportunity in this conflict. They didn't want to fight the Soviets directly, but they could help the Mujahideen. The CIA started a secret program to supply the Afghan rebels with weapons and money. They sent them things like shoulder-fired missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. Other countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia also helped the Mujahideen. This turned Afghanistan into a proxy war between the superpowers. The Soviet invasion put an end to the period of détente between the US and USSR. All the progress they had made in improving relations over the past decade seemed to vanish overnight. The US imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, trying to punish them for the invasion. They also led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Many Western countries refused to send their athletes as a way of protesting Soviet actions in Afghanistan. As the war dragged on, it became a huge problem for the Soviet Union. They had sent in thousands of troops, but they couldn't seem to defeat the Mujahideen. Soviet soldiers were dying in a foreign land for a war that seemed to have no end. The conflict was costing the Soviet Union huge amounts of money at a time when their economy was already struggling. It was also damaging the reputation around the world. People saw images of Soviet tanks in Afghan villages, and it reminded them of the invasion of Czechoslovakia years earlier. The Afghan war became a symbol of the dangers of superpower intervention. The Soviet Union thought they could quickly change the situation in Afghanistan, but they found themselves stuck in a conflict they couldn't win. It showed how even a superpower could get bogged down fighting against determined local resistance. This lesson wouldn't be lost on future leaders thinking about military interventions. In the end, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan played a big role in weakening the Soviet Union. It drained their resources, sapped their morale, and showed the limits of their military power. When Soviet troops finally left Afghanistan in 1989, it was clear that the balance of power in the Cold War was shifting. The Afghan War didn't cause the collapse of the Soviet Union on its own, but it certainly played a part. It marked the beginning of the end for Soviet influence in many parts of the world. Solidarity movement in Poland. Cracks in the Eastern Bloc. While the Soviet Union was struggling in Afghanistan, a different kind of challenge was brewing closer to home. In 1980, Poland saw the rise of a powerful movement that would shake the foundations of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. It all started in the shipyards of Gdansk, where workers were fed up with their poor conditions and lack of rights. They formed a new kind of labor union called Solidarity, led by an electrician named Lech Walesa. This wasn't just about better pay or shorter hours. Solidarity wanted real political change in Poland. The movement spread like wildfire. Soon, millions of Polish workers were joining Solidarity. It became more than just a union. It was a symbol of resistance against the communist government. People from all walks of life, doctors, teachers, farmers, they all saw Solidarity as a way to push for more freedom. The government didn't know how to handle it. They were used to crushing rebellions with force, but Solidarity was different. It was nonviolent and worked within the system, using strikes and negotiations to make their demands. At first, the Polish government tried to make some concessions. They recognized Solidarity as a legal union, the first independent union in the communist world. But as the movement grew stronger, Moscow got worried. They saw Solidarity as a threat to communist rule in all of Eastern Europe. In 1981, under pressure from the Soviet Union, the Polish government declared martial law. They arrested Solidarity leaders, banned the union, and tried to crush the movement. But Solidarity didn't give up. They went underground, continuing to organize and resist. Even with their leaders in jail and their activities banned, they found ways to keep fighting. They printed secret newspapers, held clandestine meetings, and kept the spirit of resistance alive. This persistence was crucial. It showed that even under the toughest repression, people would still fight for their rights. The struggle in Poland exposed cracks in the Soviet system. For years, Moscow had maintained control through force and fear. But now, they were facing a different kind of enemy. Solidarity showed that ordinary people working together peacefully could challenge the mighty Soviet Empire. It was a powerful example for other countries in Eastern Europe. If the Poles could do it, maybe they could too. As the 1980s went on, Solidarity's influence kept growing. The Polish government realized they couldn't just make the movement disappear. By 1989, they were forced to negotiate with Solidarity leaders. This led to the first partially free elections in the Communist Bloc. Solidarity candidates won by a landslide. it was the beginning of the end for communist rule in Poland. The impact of solidarity went far beyond Poland's borders. It showed that change was possible in the Eastern Bloc. Other countries took notice. Soon, similar movements were popping up in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other Soviet satellite states. The dream of freedom that solidarity had kept alive was spreading. By the late 1980s, the whole communist system in Eastern Europe was starting to unravel. Looking back, Solidarity's victory in Poland was a crucial turning point in the Cold War. It wasn't won with guns or tanks, but with the determination of ordinary people. They showed that even the mightiest empire could be challenged by workers armed with nothing but solidarity and a desire for freedom. The cracks that started in the Gdansk shipyards would eventually help bring down the entire Iron Curtain. Reagan, SDI, and the Evil Empire speech. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States, and he wasn't messing around when it came to the Soviet Union. Reagan had some pretty strong opinions about communism, and he wasn't afraid to share them. He thought the policy of détente that previous presidents had followed was too soft. Reagan wanted to take a much tougher stance against the Soviets. One of the first things Reagan did was increase military spending by a huge amount. He thought the U.S. military had gotten weak in the 1970s, and he wanted to build it back up. This meant new weapons, new ships, new planes, you name it. The defense budget went through the roof. Reagan believed that if the U.S. showed its strength, the Soviets would have to back down. But Reagan didn't just want better weapons, he wanted a whole new way of thinking about nuclear war. In 1983, he announced something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. This was a plan to build a shield in space that could shoot down Soviet missiles before they reached the US. It was a crazy, ambitious idea using lasers and other high-tech gadgets to zap missiles out of the sky. A lot of scientists said it wouldn't work, but Reagan pushed ahead anyway. People started calling SDI Star Wars because it sounded like science fiction. But even if it never actually worked, the idea of it scared the Soviets. They thought if the US could shoot down their missiles, it would throw off the whole balance of power. They'd spent decades building up their nuclear arsenal, and now Reagan was talking about making it useless. This freaked them out and made them even more suspicious of American intentions. Reagan didn't stop with fancy space weapons, though. He also turned up the heat with his words. In a famous speech in 1983, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. This wasn't just trash talk, it was Reagan's way of framing the Cold War as a moral battle between good and evil. He wanted Americans to see the fight against communism as more than just politics. It was about defending freedom and democracy against a truly wicked system. The Soviets, of course, didn't like being called evil. They saw Reagan's tough talk as dangerous warmongering. There were real fears on both sides that all this tension could lead to an actual war. In fact, later that same year, a NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83 almost triggered a Soviet first strike. The Soviets thought the exercise might be a cover for a real attack, and they came close to launching their own missiles. It was one of the scariest moments of the Cold War. Reagan's approach put enormous pressure on the Soviet economy. They were already struggling to keep up with American technology, and now Reagan was forcing them to spend even more on defense. This meant less money for other things, like food and consumer goods for Soviet citizens. In a way, Reagan's strategy was to outspend the Soviets, knowing their system couldn't keep up. Looking back, Reagan's presidency marked the final big escalation of the Cold War. His tough stance and military buildup pushed tensions to levels not seen since the 1960s. But it also set the stage for major changes that would come later in the decade. Reagan's pressure on the Soviet system exposed its weaknesses and helped push it toward collapse. The Cold War was entering its endgame, and Reagan's policies played a big part in how it would all turn out. Glasnost and Perestroika, Gorbachev's reforms. Reagan's pressure had pushed the Soviet system to its limits, but what happened next would shock both sides of the Iron Curtain. In 1985, a new leader came to power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was different from the old guard of Soviet leaders. Gorbachev saw that the USSR was in trouble. The economy was stagnant, people were unhappy, and the whole system seemed stuck in the past. He knew something had to change if the Soviet Union was going to survive. Gorbachev introduced two big ideas that would transform the Soviet Union: Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost means openness, and it was all about letting people speak their minds. For decades, Soviet citizens had to be careful what they said. Now, Gorbachev was telling them it was okay to criticize the government and talk about problems. Newspapers started publishing articles about corruption and other issues that used to be off limits. People could discuss topics that were once taboo, like Stalin's crimes or the failures of the Soviet system. Perestroika means restructuring, and it was Gorbachev's plan to fix the Soviet economy. He wanted to introduce some elements of capitalism into the socialist system. This meant allowing some private businesses, giving factory managers more control, and reducing central planning. Gorbachev hoped these changes would make the economy more efficient and productive. He thought if people had more economic freedom, they'd work harder, and the country would prosper. These reforms were a big deal. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could openly debate politics and society. People started forming clubs and organizations to discuss all kinds of issues. In the Baltic republics like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, people began talking more openly about nationalism and independence. Writers and artists had more freedom to express themselves without fear of censorship. But Glasnost and Perestroika also created some unexpected problems. As people gained more freedom to speak out, all the pent-up frustrations with the Soviet system came pouring out. Ethnic tensions that had been suppressed for years suddenly erupted. Different republics within the Soviet Union started pushing for more autonomy or even independence. The economy, which was supposed to improve under Perestroika, actually got worse in many ways. Shortages became more common and inflation started to rise. Gorbachev found himself in a tough spot. He wanted to reform the system, not destroy it. But once he opened the door to change, it was hard to control what happened next. Hardliners in the Communist Party thought he was going too far and weakening the Soviet Union. Reformers, on the other hand, didn't think he was going far enough. They wanted even more radical changes. As the 1980s went on, the pace of change kept accelerating. Gorbachev's reforms had unleashed forces he couldn't control. People in Eastern Europe, inspired by what was happening in the Soviet Union, started demanding more freedom in their own countries. The communist regimes that had ruled for decades suddenly looked shaky. No one knew it at the time, but the Cold War was entering its final act. Gorbachev had set out to save the Soviet system, but his reforms would end up bringing about its collapse. The fall of the Berlin Wall, symbol of change. The winds of change were blowing through Eastern Europe, but no one could have predicted the earthquake that was about to shake the foundations of the Cold War. In 1989, popular protests swept across Eastern Europe. Communist governments fell in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The people were demanding freedom and reform inspired by Gorbachev's changes in the Soviet Union. Then, on November 9th, East Germany announced its citizens could visit West Berlin. This was huge. For almost 30 years, the Berlin Wall had stood as a symbol of Cold War division. It cut right through the city, separating families and friends. East Germans weren't allowed to leave, and many died trying to escape to the West. Now, suddenly the gates were open. Word spread fast, and crowds of East Germans started heading for the wall. They wanted to see if it was really true that they could cross. At first, the border guards were confused. They didn't know what to do, but as more and more people showed up, they realized they couldn't hold them back. So, they opened the gates. What happened next was amazing. Crowds of East Germans crossed and climbed onto the wall. People from both sides came together, hugging and celebrating. They began chipping away at the wall with hammers and bare hands. It was like all the fear and tension of the Cold War was melting away. The Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War, was falling. The images were broadcast around the world. People watched in disbelief as Germans from East and West stood together on top of the wall. It was a moment of pure joy and hope. After decades of division, families were reunited. East Germans got their first taste of freedom in the West. West Germans welcomed their long-lost brothers and sisters. The fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't just about Germany, though. It marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe was crumbling. One by one, communist governments fell as people demanded change. The Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for so long was finally lifting. In the months that followed, Germany began the process of reunification. The two halves of the country that had been separated for decades came back together. It wasn't always easy. There were economic challenges and cultural differences to overcome, but the excitement of being one nation again helped push things forward. The fall of the Berlin Wall sent shockwaves through the whole communist world. If it could happen in East Germany, it could happen anywhere. People in other Eastern Bloc countries were inspired to push for more freedom. The Soviet Union tried to hold things together, but it was fighting a losing battle. Within a couple of years, the Soviet Union itself would collapse, bringing the Cold War to an end. Looking back, the fall of the Berlin Wall stands as one of the most important moments of the 20th century. It showed that peaceful protests could bring down even the most oppressive systems. It proved that the human desire for freedom and unity was stronger than any wall. The images of that night in Berlin became powerful symbols of hope and change that still resonate today. Revolutions in Eastern Europe, a wave of independence. The fall of the Berlin Wall was just the beginning. As the concrete crumbled, a wave of change was building across Eastern Europe. In 1989, we see a series of revolutions sweep through countries that had been under Soviet control for decades. People were tired of living under communist rule, and they wanted freedom, democracy, and independence. It all started in Poland with the success of the Solidarity movement, but it didn't stop there. Gorbachev's policies in the Soviet Union had a big impact. He wasn't sending in tanks to crush protests like Soviet leaders had done in the past. This gave people in other Eastern European countries the courage to stand up to their own governments. In Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, we see citizens challenging the communist regimes that had controlled their lives for so long. These weren't just small protests. We're talking about massive crowds of people filling the streets and squares of major cities. In many places, the protests were peaceful. People linked arms, sang songs, and demanded change without violence. They wanted free elections, they wanted to be able to speak their minds without fear, and they wanted their economies to work better. Hungary played a big role in all of this. They decided to open their border with Austria, and suddenly thousands of East Germans could escape to the west by going through Hungary. This was huge because it showed that the Iron Curtain, which had divided Europe for so long, was starting to fall apart. When people in other countries saw this happening, it inspired them to push for change in their own nations. In Czechoslovakia, we see something pretty amazing happen. They called it the Velvet Revolution because it was so peaceful. Protesters faced down the communist government without violence, and in the end, the communists gave up power without a fight. Writers, students, and regular people all came together to demand change, and they got it. Romania was a different story. Things got violent there. The dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, had ruled with an iron fist for years, and people were fed up. When protests started, Ceausescu tried to crush them, but it backfired. The army switched sides and joined the protesters. In the end, Ceausescu and his wife were captured, put on trial, and executed. It was a bloody end to a brutal regime. The whole system that had kept Eastern Europe under communist rule for decades was falling apart. The Soviet Union tried to hold things together, but it was like holding back a flood with your hands. By the time 1989 ended, the map of Europe looked completely different. Countries that had been part of the Eastern Bloc were now moving towards democracy and independence. The Iron Curtain that had divided the continent was gone. For the first time in a long time, people started talking about a united Europe. This wave of revolutions marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War. The Soviet Union's grip on its satellite states was broken. Within a couple of years, the Soviet Union itself would collapse. But in 1989, as people celebrated in the streets of Warsaw, Prague, and Bucharest, all they knew was that after decades of oppression, they were finally free. Dissolution of the Soviet Union, the end of an era. The Soviet Union was a giant on the world stage for decades, but in 1991, it all came crashing down. This wasn't something that happened overnight. For years, the Soviet system had been struggling. The economy was in bad shape. People were unhappy, and the whole communist idea was losing its grip. Gorbachev had tried to fix things with his reforms, but in a way, that just opened the floodgates for more problems. One of the big issues was that the Soviet Union wasn't just one country. It was made up of 15 different republics, and a lot of them wanted out. Places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been part of the Soviet Union since World War II, but they never really felt Soviet. They wanted to be independent again. The same was true for other republics like Ukraine and Georgia. People there started pushing harder and harder for freedom from Moscow's control. Things really started to fall apart in August 1991. A group of hardline communists tried to take over the government. They didn't like the changes Gorbachev was making and wanted to go back to the old ways. They put Gorbachev under house arrest and sent tanks into Moscow. But the people didn't stand for it. Boris Yeltsin, who was the leader of the Russian part of the Soviet Union, stood on a tank and called for resistance. The coup failed after just a few days, but it showed how weak the Soviet government had become. After the failed coup, things moved really fast. The different republics started declaring independence one after another. Even Russia, the biggest and most powerful part of the Soviet Union, said it was going to be its own country. Yeltsin took control and started pushing Gorbachev aside. It was clear that the old Soviet system was done for. On Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev officially resigned as president of the Soviet Union. It was a pretty sad moment. He gave a speech on TV talking about how he had tried to reform the country, but in the end, it just wasn't possible to keep it together. After he finished talking, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union was officially over. This was a huge deal, not just for the people who had lived in the Soviet Union, but for the whole world. The Cold War, which had shaped global politics for almost 50 years, was suddenly over. The United States was now the only superpower left standing. All those years of worrying about nuclear war between the US and USSR were in the past. But the end of the Soviet Union also created a lot of new problems. The different republics that used to be part of it had to figure out how to be independent countries. Some of them, like the Baltic states, did pretty well. Others had a much harder time. There were conflicts over borders and resources. In some places, there was fighting between different ethnic groups. For the Russian people, it was a time of big changes and a lot of uncertainty. The economy was in terrible shape, and a lot of people struggled to get by. The 1990s were a really tough time for many Russians as they tried to figure out what their country would be like after communism. Looking back, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was one of the biggest events of the 20th century. It completely changed the map of Europe and Central Asia. It ended the Cold War and reshaped global politics. Enduring legacy of the Cold War, global impacts across generations. The Cold War might have officially ended in 1991, but its effects are still with us today. The world we live in now was shaped by those decades of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviet Union is gone, the legacy of the Cold War continues to influence global politics, security, and culture. One of the biggest leftovers from the Cold War is all those nuclear weapons. Both sides built up huge stockpiles of nukes, and even though the Cold War is over, those weapons are still around. Countries are still working on ways to control these weapons and prevent them from being used. The threat of nuclear war might not be as high as it was during the Cold War, but it's still a concern for many people. The Cold War also created alliances that are still important today. NATO, for example, was formed to stand against the Soviet Union. But even with the Soviet Union gone, NATO is still a big player in international politics. It affects how countries work together on defense and security, especially in Europe and parts of Asia. Some of the conflicts from the Cold War aren't fully resolved either. Korea is still divided into North and South just like it was during the Cold War. Other parts of the world still have tensions that echo the old divisions between East and West. Countries still compete for influence and power in ways that feel a lot like the Cold War era. But it's not all about conflict and tension. The Cold War also pushed countries to make huge advances in technology. The space race between the US and Soviet Union led to all kinds of innovations. Today, we use satellites for communication, GPS, and weather forecasting. A lot of the computer technology we use every day has roots in Cold War research. Even the internet started as a military project during the Cold War. The ideological battles of the Cold War are still with us too. Back then, it was capitalism versus communism. Today, we still see struggles between different ideas about how countries should be run. The fight between authoritarianism and democracy is still going on in many parts of the world. Issues of human rights and freedom that were important during the Cold War are still big topics today. When we look at all these effects, it's clear that the Cold War left a complicated legacy. It reminds us how important it is for countries to talk to each other and work together. The Cold War showed us how costly it can be when nations are locked in rivalry. Today's leaders are still trying to find ways to keep the world stable and peaceful, learning from both the mistakes and successes of the Cold War era. For younger generations who didn't live through the Cold War, it might seem like ancient history. But the world they're growing up in was shaped by those decades of tension. The way countries interact, the technology we use, and even some of the conflicts we see on the news all have roots in the Cold War. Understanding this history helps us make sense of the world today and think about how to build a better future. As we wrap up our exploration of the Cold War and its lasting legacy, we've seen how this era shaped the world we live in today. The Cold War's impact remains visible across generations, from intense nuclear standoffs and ideological conflicts to pioneering advancements in space exploration. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more documentaries that dive deep into history's defining moments. Let us know in the comments which Cold War event was the most interesting to you. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next documentary. And in the meantime, explore our past episodes to uncover more stories that have shaped our world.